Chapter 12. One morning in the middle of May, I awakened to hear Timothy taking deep, great big breaths. It sounded as though he was fighting for air. I listened for a moment and then asked, "Are you all right, Timothy?" He wheezed back, "Oh, I have the fever, malar." And I had to think for a minute and understand what he was talking about. Fever? Malaria. I reached down to touch his forehead and he was burning hot. His breath coming in, big harsh sighs, and he got the malar. "I got the malar again, Philippe. 'Twill go away, but fetch me some water." When I had a fever in Virginia and in Chilaro, my mother had given me aspirin, and then she put a cold cloth on my head. We had no aspirin on the quay, and of course, the water was always warm, so I poured some water from the fresh keg to give it to him. He gulped it down and fell back on the mat. For a while, I listened to his heavy breathing, and then I ripped off a piece of cloth from what was left of my shirt, dampened it with the water, and placed it on his forehead, and he murmured, "Oh, that be good, Philippe." But suddenly he began to shiver. Even though the morning air was already warm, I could hear his teeth clacking. I had nothing to cover him with, so I just sat beside him and I held the cloth, which was already beginning to dry on his forehead. His breath was like the air from a furnace. It must have been about 10 o'clock when Timothy began to mumble and laugh and sound almost as if he were talking in his sleep. But the laughter, a little burst of it between wheezes, was very high-pitched and very strange. I couldn't keep the cloth on his head because he was tossing from side to side. So I talked to him constantly, but he didn't even know I was there. Once he got up and fell back down again on the mat. I told him to stay very still. For a long time he did. But then he began to shiver again. And when that ended, the mumbling and high laughter started all over. At noontime, the mumbling got worse, and I could feel him trying to get to his feet. I clung to his arm, shouting for him to lie down again, but he threw me to his side, as if I weren't even there. I could hear him crashing down the hill towards the sea, frightening laughter echoing back. So I followed the trail of laughter, and I heard a splash, and I knew he'd gone in the water. I yelled, "Timothy, Timothy, come back!" Suddenly, it became dead quiet, and I screamed his name again and again. There was no answer. I reached the beach, and I waded out to my knees, and then I began to move slowly, trying to keep in line with the beach. I had gone about 30 steps when I fell over. Timothy's body plunged down in the water. Holding on to him with one hand, I got to my feet again. The upper part of my body began floating, and I knew his feet were dragging on the bottom. So I put my face against his mouth. Yes, he was still breathing. So I worked myself around, put both hands under his shoulders. But he was way too heavy that way. Then I changed my hand under his chin, and I began to pull him out. He made strange sounds, but he did not try to help me. It took me what seemed like forever to get Timothy out of the water and back up on the damp sand. He must have weighed 220 pounds or 30 pounds. I could only move him 2 inches at a time. I sat beside him for almost an hour in the hot sun while he rested quietly and breathing not so harsh now. Then I realized he was shivering again. I knew I could not drag him up to the slope to the shelter of the hut, so I tore off branches of sea grape and put them over his body. The grape leaves cut the rays of the sun. I brought down water from the hut, raised his head, and ordered him to drink. With one hand, I found his lips and guided the cup to his chin. He seemed to understand and gulped it down. I stayed with him the rest of the long afternoon while he slept. Then he awakened, and he was early in the evening, and he turned cool again, when his breathing easily now, and I knew the fever had broken because his forehead was no longer hot. Sitting up, he said weakly, "How did I get down here, Philippe?" I told him that he'd ran down the hill. "Oh, that devil the fever," Timothy sighed. I said, "You went right into the water. You scared me half to death, Timothy." "Oh, that be true," he said. "My head burned with fire, and I needed to put it out." I helped him to his feet, and we went up to the hill together, Timothy leaning on me for support. For the first time, he never really regained his strength.